mention small details, technical details, from inscriptions in the Epigraphic Museum in Athens, which were found here in the Piraeus, which are lists of the equipment held by the ancient Athenian state in its dockyards in Piraeus, which lists the number of ships, how many oars the ships had, how many masts, how many rudders, and so on. So they gave us lots of details. And all those things tell us about the details of the ship. But what made it possible to actually build a reconstruction that made sense was that in, say, a harbour, in the middle harbour of the Piraeus, we still have the remains of the houses in which these ships were kept. The Neotiki. You can still see the top end of one excavated in the 1880s. In the basement of an apartment block at Sirangiu in Zaya Harbour. The importance of ship sheds was that these ships fitted tightly inside them, so those houses give us the dimensions of a ship. They tell us in particular the maximum width of a ship, because the ship had to fit inside the house between sets of columns. That tells us the ship was a maximum of 5.85 metres wide. And this was built to fit inside those sheds, and it's 5.45 metres wide. 5.45 metres wide. The length as well is determined partly because we know how many oars there are and how many oars there were at each level. We know from these inscriptions that there were 62 oars at the top, so there are 31 on each side of the top, 54 in the middle, 27 on each side, and 54 at the bottom, which is 170 altogether. And we know that they were spaced 3 feet apart, 2 cubits, a cubit is 1.5 feet, so they were all spaced 3 feet apart, which is about 0.9 metres. So we now know how long the oar section was, and also from ship sheds, and in particular from a set of ship sheds in western Greece, we know that the maximum length was about 40 metres. This one was built at 36.8 metres long. If I were building it today, I'd build her about 2 metres longer and about 10 centimetres wider. That's all. These are small details which have emerged from research over the last few years. So those things determined the general dimensions of the ship. We also know through descriptions how long the oars were. They were 9 cubits long, so 13.5 feet long, about 4 metres long. And since we know that we had to put 62 on the top and 54 in the middle and 54 on the bottom, and they had to be 9 metres long, they all had to be the same length, because you can't row unless with one man at each oar, unless they're all the same length. That determined more or less the position of each rower inside the ship. And then the ship, of course, had to be able to float, so they had to be sufficiently low in the ship so that it was stable. So when all those things were put together, it was possible to create a design which fitted all the evidence and would work as a ship. And so it's a hypothesis. We call it a floating hypothesis, a hypothesis that sits on the water. Nevertheless, it certainly looks like the ancient representations. It fits all the evidence as far as we know. A little bit more evidence has appeared in the last 30 years, so I change some details. If I didn't design it, but if I were involved in the design now. Nevertheless, this is our best guess of what an ancient tриήρης looked like. The tриήρης that fought at Salamis looked a little bit different. We know they didn't have the same type of deck, but we don't know exactly what it was like. This is a tриήρης from about 330 BC, about 150 years after Salamis. And we picked that because that is the time for which we have the most information. Most of the information we have dates from about the middle of the 4th century before Christ. And so that is when this tриήρης dates from. It wouldn't have looked all that different from the Salamis tриήρης. These ships, this type was used for nearly 900 years, we know, so clearly there was variation. There would have been variation even between two ships of the same period in the Navy, because of course they're built by different builders. So, the keel is straight. It goes up at the bows and then up again at the stern. The main part is straight. When we were looking at the design of the ship, it was suggested that the ship should be curved. The keel should be curved, a rocket keel in English. But that was rejected as a possibility. First of all, because if it was being built curved, the rowers would also have ended up in a curve, and you wanted them all horizontal. But probably even more important, these ships, when they were not in use over the winter, they were taken out of the water into these ship houses I've talked about. There were 372 of the ship houses in the 3 harbours of the Piraeus to house a huge fleet of ships, and they had to be hauled up on a gradient, on a slope, and in order to do that, it has to be hauled up over on a straight incline. So the keel needs to be straight to slide over that. And we know that they slid on the keel from literary texts. So that's why it's straight like that. And then it curves up at the stern because they were designed when operating to be backed onto a beach. So the actual angle there was determined by the man who designed it, John Coates. He went round the whole of Peloponnese one summer and measured the angles of all the beaches he could find in order to determine it. And since since he designed that, there's been some evidence to confirm that he probably got it just about right. That's why it curves up like that. That curving up as well helps with when it's brought onto the ramp to take it up into the ship house. The stern engages with the ramp, and then as it's hauled up, that will pull it up and pull the keel up onto the timbers on which it has to slide up into the shed. So it has a practical function. The sheds also had a practical function. The reason we think the ships had to fit very tightly into the shed is because when you launch a ship, as it comes from the land into the water, it becomes unstable, and there becomes a point at which it's supported on land at the stern and in the water by the flotation, and it becomes very unstable. At that point, it actually needs to lean against the ship house to stop it falling over until it comes into the water and becomes stable again. And it's important that it can't lean too far, that there's only a small space, because if it can lean a lot and fall over, it will gather momentum and maybe even knock the ship house over. And that's why we're so sure that it has to fit in very tightly, why we think there's only a few centimetres either side of the ship as it fits in the shed. So it would actually be leaning against this top bracket. You can see the oars are operated through the hull here at the lower 2 levels to the top level, so that the hull can be a bit narrower and the ship a bit faster. the oars are operated through this bracket at the top to support the top level of oars. Later on you can look at this diagram to see what it's like. Unfortunately, it's not possible to go up inside the ship. It's actually quite difficult to get up there. In antiquity, you went up ladders, which is still the only way to do it, and I think the Navy is afraid that people will fall off, and they're right. It is fairly dangerous. If we move round, is the ram of the boat. What you can see is a bronze sheeting covering the ram to help it cut into the ram. I think 11 more were found in the last 3 years. So we've now got about 50 altogether. And most of the ones, including the one at the very last one in the museum, are actually much smaller and shorter. So this is one part of the design, which again, if we're doing it now, we change it slightly. So it should look a little bit different this end. If you look at the older sheet, you come down to see that she's got a curve that way. That's not intentional. When she was built, she was level. The ship's then that's what it is. Hogging in English. This ship is hogged badly, which is hogged more on this side than on the other side. Okay, that's normal. This one's hogged probably more than intended because when the builders started building, they were not used to hogging construction. And after they built the first 7,000 joints, realised they were all loose. And they had to take all the pins out and inject the slots inside with glue to their protection.